Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the law firm of Illiάδης and Partners LCC, the Cyprus Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the University of Cyprus welcome you to the lecture of the former Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, Mr. John Gerard Bruton, entitled Ireland-Cyprus, Our Journey Towards Economic and Social Renaissance. Tonight's event is broadcasted live all over the world by the website www.thoughtforaction.org and www.skepsisyadrasis.gr. Thanks to the most valuable contribution of Thought for Action organization and Ms. Panaritis. Mr. Márιος Ηλιάδης, Managing Partner of Illiάδης and Partners LCC, will provide a preface of today's event through his prologue entitled In Search of a Framework for a Safer Journey. Mr. Ηλιάδης, the floor is yours.
Dear Mr. Bruton, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is with sincere appreciation that I thank all organizers, the University of Cyprus, the leading educational establishment of our country, the Cyprus Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the ever-responsive engine of economic growth of our little island, as well as Illiάδης and Partners law firm. I also wish to thank our sponsors, PwC, the Hellenic Bank, Hyperion Engineering Systems, as well as the Cyprus Broadcasting Corporation and Philadelphia's newspaper for their wholehearted and generous support in organizing the event. It is indeed very much appreciated. Most of all, I wish to thank John Bruton, who has given us so much of his time to be with us today, as well as the other participants in the roundtable discussion. We all know too well just how busy they are, all of them. The need to organize this important event has been long overdue, I believe. This small place, the Chrysoprasino Philo, the golden green leaf scattered in the blue ocean of the Mediterranean Sea, as described by our poets and composers, is the reason for our gathering today. It is about the past, the present, and above all, the future of this island. Similar journeys, Ireland and Cyprus, two countries with similar challenges that will determine their future. The Irish phenomenon, an example of courage, determination, and spiritual strength, a learning that will guide our thoughts and actions here in Cyprus. For me, the work, the passion, and determination that has gone into Ireland by profound leadership, and most of all, by the courage shown by ordinary people in Ireland, is inspirational. It is a poetic expression almost of what is needed urgently to capture the essence of where we go from here, to know that the black clouds in our sky will not last for long, knowing that white clouds will eventually emerge. Clouds come and go, and the sky abides. It does not change. It does not surrender. We are all bound together. The poet Theodore Roethe once said, "In a dark time, the eye begins to see." These times are of tremendous insecurity and uncertainty, but we remain vigilant with clear vision. Our keynote speaker, John Gerard Bruton, a distinguished Irish politician and an uncompromised visionary, will define those terms of uncertainty and fear and of restrictions, all of which weave a nation's disappointment and at the same time a nation's cry and need to overcome, to heal, letting new energy flow in abundance. It was the unbeatable dream of the Irish, and so it is for us today. Our key guest speaker this evening will share the meaning of instability and depict how the experiences they have had in their own land overcame limitations and empowered its men and women to hope, to believe that there are ways to a brighter future. And I believe that we, the Cypriot men and women, who do not fear in our journey of change and will steer the people of the world to see the unfairness, will bind our brotherhood once again and say no more. The courage and determination of the Cypriot people during our recent events capture Confucius' wise statement in a country, quote, "In a country well governed, poverty is something to be ashamed. In a country well governed, where unemployment has soared to the extent we are currently experiencing here in Cyprus, is indeed something to be ashamed of." It is of no surprise to any of us that change is never easy and transition is uncomfortable. But Cypriots have proved time and again that they possess strong inner qualities and the ability to form long-term relationships and friendships. It is my wish that we focus on this, that we cherish who we are and who we can be. Finding a survival kit will not be enough unless we stay faithful and consistent to our historic nature. Indeed, we need to assess carefully and respond to our current dilemma with urgency. We cannot be passive while others specify what is deemed necessary on our behalf in order to step out of the gloom. We, and only we, the Cypriot people, must build the framework of a constructive future for our people. A framework of sustainability which is transparent and coherent, a framework that embodies the needs of the Cypriots rather than the unpredictability of vested interests. So let us put our house in order. Let us acknowledge our mistakes and inconsistencies. Let us give a rebirth to our very needed economic path and develop our capacity to grow with intelligence and wisdom. Firstly, we must strictly adhere to the agreed terms that our creditors have imposed upon us. By being committed vis-à-vis our obligations without wavering, we will restore not only the credibility of our country, but also our national sovereignty, which has recently been brutally curtailed. Secondly, we must always bear in mind that all that we do or say here in Cyprus is closely monitored by the international community. This affects either positively or in a negative way our credibility as a country and our future. Thus, in plight, we establish a new orthodoxy to be based on solid foundations such as sound policy making, stability, and accountability. We welcome solutions, we welcome collaboration, we welcome new visions and innovations, we welcome global investment to create a genuine and dynamic market economy, as well as become aware of other successful economic environments. These are prerequisites to our success. I firmly believe that we as a nation are committed and must stand together to improve our country's overall investment climate, which will require a structural and strategic economic approach. We shall, with the help from our friends who have walked the walk, find alternative and enhanced methods, because poverty, as Gandhi said, is the worst form of violence. Dazzled by threats and fear, however, we are not. When we consider the magnitude of our problems, one may be tempted to feel terrified at the challenges we are asked to overcome, and our response to that is none other than the famous, again, Gandhi statement. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then you win, and we Cypriots will win. These are my views on the situation here in Cyprus. I would now like to expand briefly on my personal perception on the state of affairs of our broader family, that of Europe. A code of ethics should be adhered to, and the European family must be an example of that, so that we create a valuable partnership based on ethical behavior. It is pertinent that we begin thinking and discussing ethics. A European code of ethics that will be marked with actions that will speak louder than words, depicting transparency and solidarity. What do our European counterparts understand the definition of ethics to be, I wonder? Do we need to be creatures of some stature who would be placed alongside Jesus and Gandhi? We in Cyprus understand it to be a matter of European identity, modeled on and explicitly mirror a united and consistent practice. Every nation should respect the global family values to reflect a community, each educational, political, and economic system, so that we are all empowering the wider vision where both the sense of community and identity is strong. Our epiphany will be when we all stand together and say with respect and honesty to each other, we are bound together. This is a journey to European renaissance. To achieve this, we need a mature relationship that demonstrates mutual respect. We need to foster responsibility, personal and collective accountability, in order to be treated fairly. To unite an approach of what modernity calls behavior management without deception and greed, without malice and punishment. Thus, a code of conduct or code of ethics devised by all Europe might create a valuable partnership that seems to be missing today. What we here in Cyprus would like to see is a principle of truly belonging to the European Union. One way to provide this is by upholding the voice of choice, enabling people to exercise control over their own destiny, celebrating their own humanity. My friends, we can see our eyes are wide open. And let me finish my short introduction with an extract from Mr. Michael Higgins, President of the Republic of Ireland's speech before the European Parliament last April. He said, "From the flux of diverse histories, from our current problems, from our fears and our aspirations, I hope will emerge a response that constitutes a tapestry of many colors, of different strengths in its threads, and in its design, evocative of what memory has made endure, and the human spirit has invested with hope. Whether it is made out of wondrous reason or woven with prayer will not matter. What matters is that it be work of us all working together in cooperation, cosmopolitan and open to the world, caring for it in an intergenerationally responsible way, and embracing all our people as equal citizens." I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Iliadis. Mr. Michael Sarrís, ex-Minister of Finance, is invited on stage for his introductory remarks and for introducing the keynote speaker. Mr. Sarrís.
Good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My simple and brief task is to introduce a framework for our keynote speaker and for the subsequent panel discussion through three sets of very brief comments. One on the similarities of the road to the crisis, another on the diametrically different ways in which the Troika has responded to the crisis, and then a word about the prospects like ahead. The economic crisis in Cyprus and Ireland share a number of common characteristics, key among them that homegrown, I emphasize homegrown, policy and banking failures interacted with external influences to bring both countries to the brink of economic, financial, and social disaster. In both countries, we had a period of extended, strong economic growth and living standard improvements, fueled by foreign capital inflows, rapid bank credit expansion, and property value bubbles, all of which called for smart bank and fiscal policies. In the event, faulty bank investment practices, poor governance, lax supervisory policies, together with expansionary fiscal policies, made a crash landing for both countries almost inevitable. While Ireland was less negligent of fiscal prudence and competitiveness erosion than Cyprus, neither the EU nor the International Monetary Fund were sufficiently critical of serious challenges in both countries. External surveillance failed, and failed us badly. In both countries, poor governance, bank governance and risk management was critical. specifically unwise concentration in property lending, high exposure to individual borrowers, and in the case of Cyprus, sovereign lending were characteristics of this unwise approach. And as I said, timid supervision in a climate of unjustified reliance on bank governance to properly assess the risk was also important. This was the road to the crisis. Both countries are now implementing a comprehensive reform program focused on fiscal adjustment and structural reform. In the case of Ireland, the adjustment falls completely on the taxpayer, with severe sacrifices for its people for a very long time to come. In the case of Cyprus, and I should add really before I leave the point of what is happening in Ireland, that successful implementation in the early stages of the program translated into help by the European Union in easing the terms of the package assistance, a lesson for all of us. In the case of Cyprus, the burden is shared between depositors and taxpayers. The depositors' part is a serious blow on confidence, an experiment whose consequences, whose impact on uncertainty, an experiment that had not been tried before and was not carefully thought through, is now forcing us into trying to adjust in a totally new environment. So in ending, while for Ireland, there is a difficult but manageable future. And in my view, a return to financial markets within a reasonable period of time. In Cyprus, the jury is out. It's truly an experiment, a cruel experiment, whose answer we all have to pull ourselves together to make sure that we succeed in responding successfully. Let me now introduce our keynote speaker, who is more than a politician. He's a statesman, although people say that a statesman is a politician that you like. I am sure, but by the end of this evening, you will all like John. He's a very charismatic speaker, a distinguished career in public office, both in the economic sphere, but equally important in trying to bring the peoples of Ireland together. He will have wise things to tell us on their own experience and hopefully some lessons that we can learn from. John, thank you very much.
It's a very great privilege indeed for me and for my wife Finola, for us to be here in Cyprus and to be invited, for me to be invited to speak about lessons that can be drawn from the Irish experience. I have to make an admission, this is my first visit to Cyprus. That's a great shame, but I hope it will not be by any means my last. What I would like to talk about really are four basic things. First of all, what are the lessons that the world can learn from the recent financial crisis? Secondly, what can one say about the Irish case? What lessons can one learn from the Irish case? Then, as we're all in the same boat in Europe, and as somebody said in the recent speech, there's not much point complaining that it's your end of the boat that's sinking or your end of the boat that's leaking. We're all in the same boat in Europe, whether we be Germans or Cypriots or Irish. What does Europe need to do to put its situation right? And then, with all the modesty of somebody who's just been 24 hours in the country, I will say a few things about Cyprus, which may or may not be right, but hopefully if they're wrong, I'll be properly contradicted. First of all, the important thing to say in looking at this situation is that it is people that create wealth. And a country that has a growing population, if its people's talents are applied properly, has greater potential than a country whose population is declining. Of the countries in the European Union, the country that is expected to have the biggest increase in its population between now and 2060 is Cyprus. The country with the second largest likely population increase is Ireland. That, I think, is a sign for hope. If we can deploy the talent of those additional people who will, over the next number of years, be entering our workforces at a time when labour is going to be short in Europe, when there is going to be a lot of people retired and fewer people at work. We have the asset, people. We, the Cypriots and the Irish, have the asset, people, more young people than the other countries, and therefore we are likely to be more dynamic in the medium to long term. And I'll give you some statistics on that as I work through my speech. Secondly, I think what we've got to recognise that the mistake that was made in creating the current crisis was a mistake of blind faith in markets. There was the assumption that we had so perfected the financial markets and other markets that ultimately any difficulty that might arise will be corrected automatically. That, of course, proved to be completely wrong. Instead, markets built up a crisis that was so big that the markets alone could not solve the crisis, and one had to have the intervention of governments, whether at national level or at supranational level. So one has to re-examine the way markets work, re-examine the dynamics of capitalism, ask if, for example, capitalism, by the way capitalists are rewarded, takes too short-term a view, or fails to look at wider issues, or ask broader questions, or engages in economic activity with a tunnel vision. One has got to ask oneself, are there changes that we need to make in the way markets work so that we do not see a repetition of these problems? Thirdly, we've got to remind ourselves what is money. This is a piece of paper. Inherently, it has no value at all. And it's only because somebody has agreed that I will get 10 euros worth of produce for this, and somebody stands behind that money has a value. Now, most money is not in the form of cash. Most money is in the form of credit issued by banks. I think, in fact, cash constitutes about 5% of all the money in circulation, and credit issued by banks constitutes 95%. So without a functioning banking system, you won't have money. And without money, you won't have exchange. And without exchange, you won't have economic growth. So we have got to restore confidence in our banking system so that we can restore confidence in money so that we can have economic growth. There's a complete connection between all of those things. And furthermore, Europe in particular has got to learn that to have a single money, a euro, without a single banking system is impossible. Now, how is it that European statesmen made the mistake, including myself, when we founded the euro, of not having, from the very beginning, a single banking system, a bank resolution system, a common deposit guarantee, and one might also add some buffer fund to help countries that have asymmetric shocks? Why did we not do all of these things? Why did we not have all those insights from the very beginning? Well, to answer that question, I suppose you have to look at the dynamics of politics. I was a politician for a very long time, we tend to regard it as sufficient to solve today's problem today and think about tomorrow's problem, maybe tomorrow or perhaps even next week. And the European Union had great difficulty in actually getting the single currency underway, and in fact it just got tired before it had completed the building. It left a few slates missing, quite large slates in fact, and in fact there was no rain for 10 years, but then there was a lot of rain when the Lehman Brothers collapsed, and of course we found that we had not done a sufficiently good architectural design. But that's the nature of politics. We're now putting it right. And we're putting it right, in fact, I think, at remarkable speed when you consider all of the legislation that's already been put through towards better supervision of government finances, towards a banking union. I think, given that much of this legislation has to be agreed to unanimously within the European Union and has to be done within existing treaties, I think we've not done all that badly in moving forward. Also, I think we've got to stand back as Europeans and allow ourselves to see that the problem we face isn't a problem primarily of the fact that we have a euro, we have a single currency. The euro isn't to blame primarily for the problem. In fact, what the existence of the euro has done is that it has created some measure of mutual solidarity. I don't think the Germans would be helping us in Ireland as much as they are. They wouldn't be lending us money as much as they are if they weren't in the same currency union as us. We would have been able to go our own merry way to inflation and devaluation on our own. That's the alternative. In the absence of the euro, we would have had devaluation and inflation. And why were we going to have difficulties in Europe? Because basically, Europe has been losing competitiveness along with the rest of the Western world. Japan has had a lost decade. The United States has had major crises, huge government deficits and a decline in US exports. And we, in the developed world, mostly in Western Europe, have also lost. We've lost market share to China, to India, and all the emerging economies. So when you combine the fact that we have aging in our societies, that we had lost competitiveness, and that we had a whole lot of new competitors from the rest of the world, a crisis of some kind in Europe was going to happen, euro or no euro, sooner or later. But it was going to happen. And it has happened. And now, at least, we're able to see that we need to change. We need to change to put things right. What led immediately to the problem was, of course, artificially low interest rates. The fact that the Federal Reserve in the first place believed that monetary easing of one kind or another, under Greenspan and subsequently under Bernanke, was the way of avoiding the millennium bug shock, the 9/11 shock, the IT bubble bursting shock, that every shock, the answer to every ill in the global economy was print more money and keep interest rates down. And of course, in Europe, we decided that Germany needed low interest rates to meet the cost of German reunification. What was the effect of this policy of artificially low interest rates? Well, one of the effects was felt in the form of property bubbles in Ireland and in Cyprus, in parts of the United States, and to a lesser degree in some other European countries, including, of course, particularly Spain. But there wouldn't have been those bubbles if there hadn't been artificially low interest rates. There were good reasons for the low interest rates, and at the time there were benefits from the low interest rates, but now we're paying the price for the low interest rates. And I think we've got to recognize the long-term series of events that led to the situation that we, all of us, are now in. Could I now move on to the second part of my remarks by talking a little bit about Ireland? It's important not just to look at the very difficult 5 or 6 years that Ireland has gone through and the very difficult 5 or 6 years that Cyprus is at an earlier stage in going through. You're more or less, you're going to be in 2014 where we were in 2010. You're going to have a pretty difficult year in 2014. We had a very difficult year in 2010. But we're having a relatively better year now, 3 years later, and you're going to have a relatively better year 3 years after 2014. That's more or less the way it will work. But the background to that in Ireland's case is that we did very, very well for a very long time. In 1995, when I was Taoiseach, Prime Minister, that is, of Ireland, Ireland's GDP per head was just 80% of that of Germany. But thanks, in first place, to very strong economic growth based on genuine productivity and a lot of foreign direct investment and competitiveness and free education and good investment by successive Irish governments, by 2007, Ireland's GDP per head had reached 124% of the GDP per head of Germany. Now, if you measured it in GNP, it would have been a bit lower, but still, that was a huge level of growth. Now, in 2012, notwithstanding all the difficulties we've gone through, our GDP per head has gone back down to 107% of that of Germany. So we still have a bigger GDP per head in Ireland than the Germans have. Now, we assume that they're very rich and should be giving us more money, but it's important to say that at least as measured by GDP, which is not a very good measure, but at least as measured in that way, we're actually still slightly better off than them. And also, the growth story can be expressed in another way. Between 1995 and 2002, the Irish economy grew at 9% a year. 9% a year. The Cypriot economy grew, I think, in that period around 3% per annum. Around that, I think. The German economy only grew by 1.6% per annum. And that indicates that, they have a more recent memory of difficult times. And yes, they're doing very well now, but they're not as secure as maybe we think they are. And as I mentioned earlier, I said something about growth potential. And they are conscious of their growth potential. And I mentioned also the fact that Cyprus and Ireland have relatively young populations, whereas other countries have relatively older population. The OECD has done a study on the growth potential of a number of countries between 2016 and 2026. Now, Cyprus is not included in these numbers because Cyprus isn't in the OECD at this stage. But the OECD said 2 years ago that between 2016 and 2026, they expected the German economy to have a growth potential because of its being an elderly country by then of 1.2% a year. Italy, 1.5%. The Netherlands, 1.4%. Northern Europe has slow growth potential over the decade starting 2016. In contrast, the OECD said that the growth potential of Portugal in that period, 2.1%, almost twice that of Germany, Spain, 2.3%, and Ireland, 2.7%. And I've no doubt that if a similar study had been done for Cyprus, Cyprus would be somewhere in the region, same place as Spain. So it's understandable, I suppose, that the Germans are a little bit cautious about making long-term loans to us when they say, well, you have perhaps longer growth potential, better medium-term growth potential because of your age structure than we do. No, they might actually be very wise to lend us the money because we may be able to grow faster than them 10 to 15 years from now, and we may be in a position to help them at that stage. And I think that's the way to look at it because, as I say, we're all in this same boat together. Now, how did Ireland go wrong? Well, I'll illustrate it by giving an example that's related to our biggest bank, or it was our biggest bank, Allied Irish Bank. Between 2003 and 2008, mortgage lending by the Allied Irish Bank increased by 139%, more than doubled the amount of money that they were lending out to people to buy houses. But even worse, They're lending to people who are buying land in order to build further houses, to so-called developers, whereas the amount they lent to actually people buying houses only increased by 139%. The amount that they were lending to people who were going to buy land to build even more houses afterwards increased by 332%. In other words, there seemed to have been an assumption in our country that the only way house prices could ever go was up, and that if you bought a house, it was bound to be worth, 10 years from now, twice what it was worth today. Now, of course, that was complete nonsense. Nobody could ever really, if they thought for any length of time, believe such a proposition, that house prices would rise to infinity. And if they took a moment to think, they would have seen that that was a nonsensical proposition. But the reality is that in a boom, nobody takes a moment to think, because people are so busy making the next deal that they don't stand back. And nobody is there to force them to stand back, unless they have a very wise spouse or something like that, to force them to stand back and ask, well, is this really going to work? And unfortunately, it didn't work. Also, the same problem afflicted our government. Our government in that period saw this huge level of housing activity, twice what had been the case 10 years previously. And it had substantial taxes on every housing transaction. There was value-added tax on the sale of houses. There was stamp duty on the sale of houses. There was capital gains tax revenue on the sale of houses. And we reached a point there where in 2002, a very large 8% of all government taxes were coming from house sales. By 2006, 18% of all government revenue was coming from house sales. So, of course, when the bubble burst and house prices were no longer rising and people were not selling houses anymore, or nobody wanted to buy them anymore because things were looking bad, government revenues collapsed. Now, of course, if anybody in the Department of Finance in Ireland, and I was finance minister twice actually, had taken a moment to think, they would have realized that having your tax revenue so dependent on one activity, the buying and selling of houses, was nonsense. And that would be nonsense to increase government salaries, to increase health services, to increase social welfare payments, as we did during that time on the strength of temporary revenues, that creating permanent commitments on the basis of temporary revenues wasn't sensible. If you took a moment to think, if anyone had taken a moment to think in the Department of Finance, they would have seen that that wasn't a good thing to do. But again, things were going so well that nobody took a moment to think, and that anybody who did raise any questions about the viability of this would be swept aside as somebody who was anti-national, was against prosperity, was naturally pessimistic, had no interest in the future of the country, and was just another Jeremiah. And of course, that mistake was made. And I think that was aggravated by the fact that in our country, and I suspect also in this country, the existence of silo thinking arises, that people who are responsible for a particular part of a problem in financial supervision or indeed in decision-making in banks would say that as long as I'm achieving my targets, as long as I'm getting that increase in the number of loans that I'm supposed to be approving in my area of activity, as long as I'm getting to achieve my target, I don't really have to think about the bigger picture. The bigger picture is for somebody else. But the trouble was, of course, that the top people in the banks were also saying the bigger picture is for somebody else. And the people in the government were saying, oh, the bigger picture is for somebody else. So you had all this silo thinking and nobody looking at the big picture. And also, I think, in our country, and it may also be a factor here in Cyprus, I don't know if this is the case, but in island nations, there is a tendency to have one view of everything. If you go to the United States, they seem to never have one view about anything. There's always controversy about even the most simplest proposition leads to ideological conflict in the United States. And that's rather trying if you're living in the United States, as I was for 5 years, to have to listen to all this controversy where people never seem to agree on anything. But the difficulty of smaller countries like Ireland and Cyprus is that we tend to have one view of every problem. And that can be very good if it's the right view. But if it's the wrong view, it can be quite a problem. And I'm afraid that combination of silo thinking and consensus thinking were problems that Ireland faced. That's how we got into the difficulty. Where are we today? First thing I think I'd like to say about where Ireland is today is that the programme that we put together, and it was originally a programme largely put in place by the Irish government themselves before we had to look for help. So it has a harp on it, so to speak. It has an Irish provenance. And it contains very detailed commitments about reforms in the structure of our economy and also fiscal milestones that we must pass each quarter. And we're subject to a quarterly inspection by the Troika. Ireland has achieved every one of those quarterly targets since the beginning. And as has been stated by the former Minister of Finance a moment ago, that has had the beneficial effect that once we established a track record of meeting our targets, we had the credibility to ask for a change in the terms, and we got a change in the terms. The rate of interest and the rescheduling of the promissory notes were two things that were changed in our favour, and would only have been changed in our favour if we had first kept our word on the commitments that we'd given. So it's very important, I think, not to raise questions too soon about changes that might be appropriately made in the programme. First achieve the targets, establish a track record, and then argue with the EU, the IMF, and the ECB for changes, but do that argument in private rather than in public. Because people in the IMF, people in the ECB, and people in the EU institutions, they're human beings too, with all the foibles and weaknesses of human beings. And they have egos as well. And they don't want to be seen to be changing something because they've been publicly berated for that proposal in advance. They'd prefer to be asked to make the change in private and then announce the change themselves in agreement with the Cypriot authorities or with the Irish authorities, as if it was their idea rather than an Irish or a Cypriot idea. They've got to be given ownership, if you like, of the change. So to the extent that this memorandum isn't as good as it should be, and it's bound not to be, being a human product, as good as it should be, and it's bound not to contain all the insights that the best experts on Cyprus could contribute. And who are the best experts on Cyprus? It's the Cypriots, not people living in Washington or Brussels. You know your own country best. You know what will work best. But to make the changes that reflect that, I think you need to box clever rather than to be seen to be doing the matter on the public stage. And that's what we did, and that's how we were able to, I think, to get the changes that we got. What has happened as a result of that? Well, our competitiveness has improved. Office rents, which were astronomically high, have fallen by 52%. Unit labour costs have fallen by 12%. The costs of business services have fallen by about 7%. Far too small a fall, I'd say, because there's still a lot of uncompetitive activity in the legal and other professions in Ireland. There's still far too many costs involved with getting permits for different activities in Ireland, too much complexity and regulation, and there are vested interests who have a stake in complexity, and these are even harder than the trade unions to confront, because very often their little cosy arrangements are hidden from view in a way that others aren't. But we have made progress, particularly in some areas. We have moved to a point where social protection and health represent 66% of all spending. And of course, they're quite difficult to reduce. But we're beginning to make some progress in that area. There's a lot more we could do. Employment grew in the second half of 2012. When you consider we are in a recession and employment still grew, that's good. Unemployment has fallen from 15% to 13.5%. And that's, I think, quite a major thing to say. It's still, of course, far too high. Long-term unemployment, on the other hand, and this, I think, is something that was referred to in Marios' speech, the fact that there is a lot of people who are plugged into the economy and able to take whatever opportunities come is good. But there is about 15 to 20% of the people who, because of their educational level, or perhaps they didn't get the benefit of a good education when they were 6 or 7 years of age, they're now not as adaptable to the globalised market. And long-term unemployment is a problem in Ireland. And in fact, I think 20% of the long-term unemployed in Ireland are living in a house where nobody has a job. And that's, I think, the highest proportion of long-term unemployment or chronic long-term unemployment anywhere in the OECD. And it's something that we've got to do something about by having good labour activation policies. And if I were advising, and I know that this is something that you're going to have to face because unemployment is rising here, and you're going to have to find ways of ensuring that people don't become dependent on welfare payments, that they're incentivized to find new employment opportunities, that they're incentivized to take on training programs that are relevant to the job market, not just training programs that keep them occupied, but training programs that are relevant to the job market. And I would particularly think you should look at the countries that have the best record on that, which would be, I think, Finland and Denmark, not my country. And also, as I said, Ireland has a good record in implementing the various structural reform recommendations that have been made to us by the OECD. Now, as I said, there's still a few things we need to do, but we have a good record. You will be surprised, I think, or maybe you won't, when I tell you what was the finding of the OECD as to the countries that were best in the last 4 years at adopting OECD recommendations for structural reforms to make their economy more efficient. The best country for adopting OECD recommendations for improved structural efficiency, which will eventually yield substantial results, was Greece. The second best was Spain. The third best was Ireland. Now, I don't have a figure for Cyprus because you're entering the programme anyway and you're not in the OECD. But I think those are interesting statistics. The crisis in those 3 countries made us do things that we wouldn't otherwise have done and made us lay down a foundation for growth in the future. Which countries were worst, according to the OECD, in accepting the well-thought-out recommendations for structural reform that the OECD made to them? Germany topped the list for not accepting recommendations. Switzerland was second, and Luxembourg was third. This shows that when you're doing very well, you get complacent, and you don't feel you can learn anything from anybody. In contrast, when you're not doing so well, like Ireland, Spain, Greece, and Cyprus, well, you're prepared to learn, and you're also prepared to act. And I think that's, a good sign for the future. Now I want to say a few words about Europe and what Europe has to do. I've already made the point that the euro per se is not responsible for our problem. Low interest rates and absence of structural reform, loss of competitiveness and ageing are the causes of the problems that Europe has faced. What the euro has done is it has prevented countries from engaging in devaluation and inflation as means of solving profound problems, and it has imposed a measure of solidarity, because the breakup of the euro would cost the countries of Northern Europe a large amount of money. So they have an interest in ensuring that Cyprus prospers and comes through its current difficulties, as they have in Ireland's doing so. And without the euro, they wouldn't have that interest. And that's an important thing to say. Obviously, there are a number of other difficulties facing the euro. Dutch banks are going to need a substantial amount of recapitalisation. The stress tests of the banks in a number of large countries in Europe are probably going to reveal quite substantial holes that need to be filled. We at least know in Ireland and Cyprus what our problems are. They don't, to a degree. Obviously, the fact that in the Cyprus case, a bail-in of depositors has been postulated is going to make it more difficult for banks in other countries to raise money. There are still no common rules agreed for the winding up of banks. We have proposals, but we haven't them agreed yet. We still have problems in Italy with the political system and whether Italy's government can deliver on its commitments to qualify for OMT, outright monetary transactions, if they need to qualify. And we have, all over Europe, delayed implementation of the Services Directive, so we're not achieving the efficiencies of a single market in services that we ought to be achieving. And also Europe lacks a demos. All the participants in the European Union are democracies. But when we think about Europe's problems, we think of Europe's problems as Cypriots. How do Europe's problems affect us as Cypriots? How do Europe's problems affect us as Irish? What's the Irish interest in Europe? Germans think of Europe as Germans. We need to start thinking as Europeans. We need to have a European demos, and we need to create a venue for that, and that's why I've argued that we should have a presidential election in Europe, in the European Union, just as they have one in the United States, so that every 5 years we would have a debate in which we would all be voting on the same choice of policies for the varying people competing to be president of Europe. We need to create a demos in order to provide legitimacy for all of the difficult and intrusive things that we're going to have to do to make the euro work, such as implementing the two-pack and the six-pack, which are going to involve a lot of intervention in the policy making in Cyprus, in Ireland, but also in all of the other countries. Bear in mind that Germany is going to have to be subject to exactly the same intrusion and exactly the same approval process for its budget as we will have to under the six-pack and the two-pack. And that is going to be difficult to implement, but also absolutely necessary. We've also got to recognise that in Europe, we need some sort of a shock absorber. Change is essential. Change is essential, but shocks are bad. We don't need change to occur so rapidly that it constitutes a shock. We need change to occur in a planned and deliberate way. And that's why we need reform programmes and avoid bubbles. And if there are bubbles bursting, we need to have a shock absorber or some form of assistance, either in the form of a rainy day fund to help governments to get into difficulty, pooling of some of the responsibility for unemployment benefit across Europe, so that there would be an unemployment assurance system for all of Europe. There's no federation in the world that doesn't pool its unemployment assurance. They do so in Brazil, they do so in the United States. We don't do it in Europe. But it's necessary, I think, as a shock absorber. Or perhaps we should have some system of varying VAT rates so that countries that are in difficulty are allowed to reduce their VAT rate. Now, I'd like to come towards the conclusion of my remarks to say something about Cyprus, and particularly about Cyprus' recent experience. I think the fact that when the European authorities insisted, maybe they had to do so, but insisted that there be a haircut imposed on sovereign bondholders of Greek bonds. It should have been immediately foreseen and foreseeable. on the part of those authorities that that was going to have an immediate knock-on effect on Cyprus. But it seemingly passed them by completely. People didn't, in Europe, see the interconnection between making this decision in Greece and the effect that would have in Cyprus. Now, was there an alternative decision? Perhaps not. But if there wasn't, some contingency support should have been put in place at that stage to help Cyprus out of its difficulty. And it's that lack of making the connections which suggests to me that the silo thinking that we have in Ireland also exists in Europe, that people in the various parts of the European Commission only think of their own little bit of the jigsaw and don't think of the overall picture. Otherwise, such a decision wouldn't have been made. I think it's also important for us to have, in addition to a policy for structural reform and rectifying our financial and banking problems, we need to have a policy for economic growth. Now, I was listening to an economist in Dublin not so long ago, and I think he must be the most honest economist I ever came across, because he said, well, there's one thing economists don't know about, and that is how to promote economic growth. We can tell you what's wrong after it's happened, but we can't tell you how to make an economy grow. Maybe he was right or maybe he was wrong. I think what at least one can say with truth is that, and confidence, is that misallocating capital makes an economy grow less well than it would otherwise do. So spending too much money on houses when there are other things you could be spending it on, that's a misallocation of capital, which inhibits growth. Secondly, I think we can all agree, as I said earlier in my speech, that a functioning banking system that can lend money to people who have good ideas is essential for economic growth. And thirdly, that you need an economy that is sufficiently flexible, whether it be in its services sector or in its labour market, that it can reallocate resources and people and talent to where the new opportunities are and away from where the old opportunities were. Those are the three ingredients, I think, that at least economists could say they can suggest would help an economy and help the Cypriot economy to grow. What does that say about the current situation here in this country? I think it would suggest that you should put at least as much emphasis on the structural reform part of your programme as you do on achieving the fiscal targets. And I read the first report on Cyprus, and it was giving very high praise to this country for what it has done on the fiscal targets, but they were a little bit less full of praise of what has been done, for example, in revenue administration, in loosening up the professions, and in things like that. I think you need to give some thought to those things. I think it's also important to have a hard look at your educational system and ask yourself, are you educating people, and are people choosing courses that reflect the future? Or are they choosing courses that reflect the past? In the past, when you had a large economy based on banking and deposits from coming over other parts of the world, there was lots of work for lawyers, lots of work for accountants. But if you were, for example, to follow the Israeli example of developing a high-tech economy, well, then maybe you won't need quite so many accountants, and you'll need more people with technical qualifications of one kind or another. And maybe in your school system, you'll have to do what Ireland has to do, put more emphasis on mathematics, hard subjects like mathematics, hard subjects like science, and perhaps a little less time on some of the subjects that it's easier to get good marks in and therefore to get into university. You need to reallocate. Time is money. Time in education is probably more valuable than any other time anyone will spend, because it's time that has a longer perspective in terms of its effect. So allocate that time, allocate intellectual and educational resources in the way that will promote long-term technical advance based out of Cyprus. I think also it is a major opportunity, the current difficulty is a major opportunity to find a way through in respect of the difficulties concerning the partition of this island, the availability of natural gas resources, is something that is potentially of benefit to everybody in the Mediterranean basin, not just to the country off whose immediate shore that resource exists, but to everybody has potential to gain. Everybody has potential to gain from this. And it is important that you should see the difficulty that you're currently in as also an opportunity, perhaps, to resolve other issues that need to be resolved, because you can turn what it might be a lose-lose situation into a win-win situation. And I would like to conclude my remarks now by saying that in the short time that I have spent here, I have found an optimism, a sense that, well, this is pretty awful what has happened to us, and it's most certainly not our own fault, and that you're right, it's the fault of others. But also a sense that as Cypriots, you feel that you're well capable of getting on top of this problem, that it's going to be and is a matter of national pride to you to resolve this problem yourselves, and that you will do so. I'm confident you will succeed. And I think, I would say that 10 years from now, people will be talking about the Cypriot miracle. How, just as Germany, which was the sick man of Europe in 2000, became the German miracle of 2012 and 2013, because it faced up to certain difficulties it had at that time. Just as Germany was transformed from being the sick man to the miracle economy of Europe, that Cyprus can also, if it hews religiously and strongly to the course that it is to follow, and does so, as Marius would say, in an ethical fashion, that you have the capacity to be 10 years from now. And if I'm still alive, I'd be happy to come back and observe the Cypriot miracle in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, John. What we do and what we say or we don't say is carefully watched by people who are thinking about investing in Cyprus and hopefully lending money to Cyprus. A man who knows a lot about that and will talk about it is Athanasios Vamvakidis. He's a man I have known and admired since 1996 when, as from Harvard Economics, he came to the World Bank, IMF, as a summer intern, then spent 13 years at the IMF and is now Managing Director Europe at Merrill Lynch, Bank of America. And he will talk to us about what is expected of us from the investment and financial markets. Athanasios?
Έχω ασχοληθεί με την... sorry, I'll say it in English. I've worked on Cyprus on a number of occasions during the last 15 years or so. When I started at the IMF, in the first years of my career, I moved to the European department, and I was actually covering the periphery countries. And from 2001 to 2004, I was part of the team that was visiting Cyprus. These were the good years in the country that led to the EU membership. Then, when from 2007 to 2010 at the IMF, when the global crisis started, we put together the so-called early warning exercise, and we were looking at vulnerabilities across the globe as the global crisis was affecting everybody. And as the periphery crisis was starting, also Cyprus is one of the countries that we were looking at. And since I moved to the private sector in 2010, I spent a lot of my time covering the periphery crisis. And more recently, I was following the crisis in Cyprus for two reasons. People who are concerned that Cyprus could have broader implications in the rest of the Eurozone despite its small size, but also investors who were looking at the country perhaps as opportunities more into the longer term. So I'm really happy that the organizers of this event give me the opportunity to share my thoughts based on this experience. Now, I will focus on the question of how to regain market confidence. Now, as Mr. Ηλιάδης very rightly saw, what happens in Cyprus affects and has implications beyond Cyprus, and the world is listening, and the markets are also listening. So it is important, and clearly it has implications for the rest of the Eurozone, not only the developments here, but also how the Troika deals with the problems in Cyprus. But at the same time, one can ask, well, do we really care what markets think? And markets, as Mr. Bruton very rightly showed, sometimes are wrong. And indeed, the global crisis that we had since 2007 that has spread into Europe, to a large extent, it was a major market failure. Well, from my experience at the IMF and in the private sector, I will say that when markets go back to a country, when a country manages to regain their confidence, most of the time markets are right. Because markets initially are very skeptical, and countries need to do quite a lot of things right in order to regain market confidence. So from this point of view, it is important to ask these questions, and at the end of the day, you need market confidence as a key element for any economic recovery, especially in the case like Cyprus, where because of some choices that were made by the Troika, some unfortunate choices, confidence has been affected negatively, substantially. Now, unfortunately, we cannot see the graphs, but it's okay. The messages are still here. So I will go through the list of things that I think that need to be done, and not surprisingly, the first is fix the banks. If you could see the charts here, you could see the drop in deposits that we have seen since the crisis started in Cyprus. In the first chart, and there's a second chart that you see the private sector credit growth that in all the periphery countries has turned negative, and more recently in Cyprus. Now, you need to fix the banks, especially in the case that, like in Cyprus, that it was the main reason for the crisis, but also in order to have a recovery, you need the banks to extend credit to the economy. And this is important for Europe because Europe is a bank-based financial system. Capital markets are not as developed as the United States, so you need the banks. It is not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition. And from this point of view, the recent IMF report, I think, is quite encouraging. Still, there are a lot of issues in the banking sector, but at least progress recently has moved in the right direction. But this is absolutely a must. This is the first step to gain back market confidence. You need to put this behind you. You need to clean up the bank balance sheets. You need to recapitalize the banks. And guess what? When you do that, then deposits will come back. Then you will be able to remove the different restrictions that you have in place now. And we have seen this in a number of countries. More recently, we have seen it in Greece, where after the recapitalization of the banking sector, deposits gradually have started coming back. Meet the fiscal targets by focusing on quality, not just quantity. Now, the graphs here were just showing that the fiscal imbalance in Cyprus are not actually as severe. The debt level It's much lower than in Greece, much lower than in Italy, in Portugal. The debt dynamics are better than in Spain, even though the level is lower in Spain. So the problem is not as challenging as in other countries. Still, there is a substantial fiscal consolidation that needs to take place. And there is a lot of discussion between a trade-off between austerity and growth. But my view is that, unfortunately, this discussion focuses too much on quantity, not so much on quality. You can do fiscal consolidation by doing fiscal reforms. As Mr. Bruton mentioned earlier, tax reform in Cyprus is extremely important. Public administration reform. Reforms that you reduce spending, but at the same time you create a leaner and much more efficient public sector. And this is less negative on growth and could be even positive for growth in the long term than if you just have horizontal cuts, that it's a kind of austerity that has an immediate and direct negative impact on your economic growth. The Greek example is a clear case where if you look at the fiscal adjustment in Greece in structural terms, adjusting for the fiscal cycle, is the largest fiscal adjustment in history. But it was all horizontal. It was not based on reforms. So it was really the worst way to do it. In a way, it's like in the US, the so-called sequester that we say, that is an accident because the two parties have been unable to reach an agreement. They went to the default option in which you cut spending across the board. This is exactly the fiscal consolidation Greece has been having in recent years. Don't do the same thing. And guess what? This is Cyprus' decisions. It's not the IMF decision. The IMF focuses on the overall targets. It's up to Cyprus to decide how to reach these targets. So do it with reforms. It will minimize any negative impact on growth, and in the long run, actually, it will lead to more growth. Never waste a crisis. Implement structural reforms. And there was a chart here with different indicators, the World Bank Doing Business indicator, the Index of Economic Freedom, the World Economic Forum competence indicators, in which all of these indicators show that Cyprus actually looks good, particularly compared to the rest of the periphery. It has a business-friendly environment. Still, however, compared to all the advanced economies, it's somewhere in the middle. So there is still a lot of room for structural reforms. And these are reforms that, as Mr. Bruton again said earlier, you, the Cypriots, know much better what needs to be done. You know what are the rigidities, and you know what will be the most effective way to do it. However, these reforms are difficult because you have to go against vested interests. But these are the reforms that will increase potential growth. These are the reforms that will increase productivity. And these are the reforms that could help an economy like Cyprus that needs to change its growth model, do it faster and most efficiently. Here we can see the graphs. In the Greek case, we cannot ignore the impact of what is going on in Greece on Cyprus. After all, to quite a large extent, the crisis in Cyprus was the result of the Greek PSI. The Greek debt remains unsustainable. You can actually see here in the first chart, it's quite striking. The first line on the top is the latest debt dynamics based on the IMF projections. After the PSI, after the voluntary debt exchange scheme, the debt dynamics are the worst they've been in this program. There is no way Greece will ever repay this debt. Even if Greece meets all the targets, the program assumes that Greece will reach a primary surplus of 4% of GDP and keep it there forever. No country has ever done something like that, unless it has oil. And Greece might discover oil. It does have olive oil, but I don't think it can achieve 4% primary surplus for the time period for the next 3 decades in the IMF debt sustainability. But the good thing about Greece actually is that Greece has negotiating power at this point, because if you see in the second graph, almost 80% of Greek debt is owed to the official sector, to the rest of Europe, to the IMF, to the ECB. And actually, for the first time this year, Greece will have a small primary surplus. So actually, Greece has negotiating power because it's at the point that the rest of Europe could not really threaten Greece to pull the plug. If they pull the plug, Greece will not be able to repay them. It will not need to implement more austerity measures to cover its own needs. So the dynamics have changed. Now, this suggests that as long as Greece implements the program, the rest of Europe will try to make it easier for Greece to repay this debt, and indeed this is exactly what they promised to the IMF. This is why the IMF is able to proceed despite the sustainable debt dynamics. Politically, this is not easy. Most likely will take the form of continuous extension of maturities in repeated negotiations, not in one go. But this suggests that as long as Greece manages to implement the program, even if it's not perfect program implementation, most likely you have seen the worst as it concerns the spillovers from Greece. But clearly, this discussion is worth following, looking forward, because of the direct and indirect spillover possible effects from Greece. Now, the periphery itself remains fragile. Now, you hear quite often that the periphery has adjusted and external balances have declined. Indeed, a lot has been done, a lot that would not have been possible for anybody to imagine without the crisis. But the truth is that a lot of the adjustment in the macroeconomic numbers has come because of the recession. And you see this in the first chart, where we look at the intra-euro imbalances before the crisis, the large surpluses in the core, the large deficits in the periphery. And more recently, they have adjusted, but you can see very clearly these imbalances have not adjusted because the surpluses in the core have declined. They've adjusted because the periphery's deficits have declined. And the periphery deficits have declined because the periphery has a recession and imports have collapsed. A more healthy adjustment would have been if the core had reduced its surpluses, so it would have imported more from the periphery, so the adjustment of external balance in the periphery would have been through exports. So looking forward, the adjustment that has taken place so far is not a very good indicator, because actually the periphery needs to gradually export its way out of this recession. Otherwise, this adjustment is something that is just not sustainable. And in the second chart, we look at the official IMF projections on debt to GDP ratios before and after the ECB announced the OMT. Now that's important because the OMT increased market confidence. Many people in the market believe that the Eurozone is not anymore in crisis, or just what happens in the periphery doesn't affect markets anymore. But actually what the ECB has done is just bought time. If you look at this graph, you see that the debt today in all the countries is projected to be higher than the projection before the OMT program. So the question of whether the periphery is solvent or not remains, and it is very likely that at some point the core countries, sooner rather than later, will be called to transfer more money to the periphery. Now, the advice that I will have from my personal experience, both from the IMF and in the private sector to Cyprus, is go beyond implementing the program. Now, program implementation matters. We have seen it in the case of the periphery, the recession in Ireland and Portugal, where the programs were implemented. It has been less deep than in Greece, where the program was not implemented rightly. Also in the case of Greece, we saw that up until last year that there were serious implementation problems. The recession was getting deeper and deeper. This year, the program implementation has improved. The economy is starting to turn around. As we said, the second derivative of the data has turned positive. IMF studies clearly show that program implementation matters. And at the end of the day, strong implementation makes it easier for, as again Mr. Bruton emphasized, makes it easier for Europe to stand by you and help you. If you implement the program, it's easier for you to negotiate easier terms, extension of maturities, more money if it is needed. But when you have not implemented the program, it's almost impossible to negotiate with the rest of Troika to make it easier. Now, from our own experience in programs that succeed are the ones where the authorities treat the IMF and the Troika in this case as advisors, not as bad cops. Sometimes for unpopular measures, you may need to say, okay, we have to do it because this is the agreement with the IMF. But for the overall philosophy of the program, it's much better if there is ownership, if you do it not because the IMF is telling you to do it, but because this is the good for the country. And if these are popular measures, when you have leaders who are able to persuade the public that this is what the country needs. These are the programs that succeed, and this will be the best case in the case of Cyprus. Now, some final remarks. I think it is important to emphasize the strong commitments of Cyprus to stay in the euro. Now, why am I mentioning this? When you look at the government yields in Cyprus and in Greece, they remain for 10-year maturity above 10%. In all the other peripheral countries, they've declined well below these levels since Draghi announced the OMT to address exit risks. This means that borrowing costs do reflect some exit risks. I think people in the markets underestimate the resolve of people in both countries, in Cyprus and in Greece, to stay in the Eurozone. Reasons that go well beyond economics. I think this is very, very important in order to gain market confidence back, to show outside to the outside world your commitment to the euro and the European project more generally. Political unity behind the reforms matter. Again, in the case of Greece, the fact that there was no political unity even today behind these reforms has clearly cost the ownership of the program and the accepted by the public. The case of capital controls, it is unfortunate, but it was inevitable here in Cyprus. But I will say that if you do everything right, if you fix the problems in the banks, if you implement the program, gradually the capital controls and the limits, the remaining limits for any deposit withdrawals will be redundant. So this will be what will determine the timing of removing these controls rather than to do it too early. You should do it when the economy is ready, and this will be determined by program implementation. Clearly, as the IMF has repeatedly said, the depth of the recession is the main risk. We are really in uncharted territory. The shocks that the Cyprus economy has been subject to, particularly the haircut of deposits, is really, really something unique. So, although the IMF is very cautious in its projection, the truth is that indeed we don't know because we don't have past examples to guide us. However, what we do know is that when you do a critical mass of reforms, you reach a tipping point in which you gain back market confidence. More importantly, you gain back the confidence on the people, and especially small countries like Cyprus can have what we call a V-shaped recovery. So again, it goes back to the substance, which is do implement the necessary reforms. Avoid sector picking. If you have a business-friendly environment, then the entrepreneurs will find the best sectors that will lead Cyprus to the next growth model. The emphasis of Cyprus on FDI, it's important, is positive, and should continue. It might be in other sectors, not necessarily the financial sectors we had in the past, but it's something that for small economies matter a lot and could really make the big difference between a V-shaped fast recovery or a U-shaped recovery. And finally, the energy sector, I would say, treat it as a bonus. Many countries with natural resources, these resources come at the expense of actual reforms, and actually many countries with natural resources, they don't do very well exactly for these reasons. Now, I believe that it is unfair that the program assumes zero revenues from energy in its debt sustainability. Yes, these revenues are certain, but assuming that it's zero, it's extreme. But this is what we have at this point, and clearly energy could allow Cyprus to recover faster, but not at the expense of the necessary reforms. Because the energy sector will have, but by its own, it's not sufficient in order to help Cyprus to a sustained recovery and a new growth model looking forward. And with this, let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vamvakidis. The audience will have the opportunity to participate in the open discussion that will follow the roundtable discussion between Mr. Bruton, Mr. Sarrής, Mr. Vamvakidis, and Mr. Kliridis. The prominent guests are invited on stage for the roundtable discussion. On the second seat.
Basically, they are programs designed by economists that ignore sociology, they ignore psychology, and they ignore politics. And we saw how programs can go astray by the things that they cause. We saw the collapse of the socialists in Greece and the resurrection of the extreme left and the extreme right. And all of a sudden, completely out of the blue, comes the possibility of Greek exit because Kipros was very near being elected. And I think this is one of the worries that I have here in Cyprus. It's not that the programs are bad, but how the political system is going to respond to it. We saw the near miss that we had last 2 weeks ago. And this process of politicians jockeying for position to get voter acceptance can jeopardize, I think, the whole program.
Does anybody want to add anything to that?
I can address, I mean, clearly when in a program you need to implement very tough austerity measures, it's difficult, it is unpopular, and in politics what we see quite often, I mean, there are many empirical studies actually that can predict election results based on the GDP growth in the previous years. To put it simply, when there is a recession, people will vote for the other guy, even if the other guy is crazy. There are many parameters, however, that can affect the depth and the duration of a recession. I emphasized program implementation earlier and ownership of the program. The IMF decision to continue a program or not is a binary decision, yes or not. And there are many ranges of implementation within this. And you can have a case that up to an extent, unfortunately, was in Greece, that they have been doing just enough so that the Troika does not pull the plug, but clearly not enough to gain the people's and markets' confidence back, not enough to restructure the economy as needed. Clearly, in these cases, the recession is much, much worse. It is an economic crisis. You need to deal with it as an economist. It is very difficult to expect how the politics will evolve. Nobody could have ever expected the depth of a recession in Greece. Actually, when you look at the numbers, if you compare the Greek crisis to other crises, the collapse of GDP is the worst it has been in recent crises, and actually you have to go back to the US Great Depression. This is how bad it has been. It's much worse than East Asian financial crisis, Argentina, Turkey, Russia in '98. It's really the worst crisis of the recent history. But again, I think if you ask the Greek public, and there were many polls, they wanted reforms. Nobody believed that the country was moving in the right direction before. But I think the consensus now is that things are not really changing. Reforms are not really taking place to the extent that they had expected, and they are desperate. So as a result, they end up to vote for populists, for extreme parties.
I think, no, just a comment. I think on the fiscal side, as was already said, and as the minister has said repeatedly, there was so much fat in the Cypriot budget that it was relatively easy to get close to the targets. But when we talk about things like privatization, we tend to talk of it more in terms of establishing a framework, doing a study, and getting some money from selling them, while in fact, this new economic paradigm that you all alluded to, and this is something that I would like you to comment on, because it's all very nice to say, let's do something that is different from financial services, let's put a level playing field, and the economy will find the sectors. But we need to know a little more about this. So I'd like to ask John first, and then Thanos and Marios, how much emphasis should we be putting in a much bolder political statement behind of doing this tougher to do structural reforms like privatization, like labor market, like a very good energy sector plan, like reforming the welfare state, like reforming the public sector, going into the details and really doing this. And what more can we say about the prospects of young people finding jobs as they return back from their studies, other than saying that better days are lying ahead when we implement the structural reforms? Perhaps we can start with John.
Well, I think economists have to start by admitting that the current economic crisis is, in a sense, a failure of economics. Economics as a discipline became overconfident in the mathematical models that it had. It became overconfident in the efficient market theory that markets would find their own level. And it hasn't said it's sorry for having got it all wrong. Now, it is beginning to change. You see the development of behavioral economics, which is introducing psychology into economics, and not before time. There seems to be, of course, no much dialogue between political science and economics, because political science has also committed the same error as economics, as becoming over-dominated by mathematics and not engaging with the reality of human life and the way people interact with one another, both as individuals, as shoppers, and in groups. The question, of course, is, are the international organizations properly arranged to ensure that those insights are brought to bear? Isn't the division between the World Bank, which is concerned with development, and the IMF, which is concerned with financial numbers, a rather artificial division? Shouldn't there be much more pooling of and use of World Bank ideas in the programs of the IMF? And indeed, doesn't the European Union need to learn a lot from the IMF? Because the IMF at least is questioning some of its own assumptions. One detects not the same level of questioning of its own assumptions on the part of the EU institutions. That's not to say that I believe that politicians can come together and decide the destiny for their countries and decide what's going to happen and all of that. But I think you can apply sort of inductive reasoning rather than deductive reasoning. In Ireland's case, we've been very successful in attracting foreign direct investment because we had people on the ground in America who were looking at, which were the firms that had help wanted ads, which were the firms that were expanding. And it wasn't that somebody in Dublin said, oh, pharmaceuticals is the area to get into, or IT is the area to get into. It is that we had people in America who were looking at the firms that were expanding and went to those firms and said, well, mightn't you be able to expand in Ireland rather than in Cleveland? And some of them did. So I think, that sort of, so long as the government is engaged in constantly looking at what's happening in the market, it can give an appropriate nudge to the market in the direction that growth will come from.
Marios?
I'll go back a bit on the what John said about a failure of economics, that indeed I believe we became too mathematical. We look at how we treated the banks here. Mathematics, yes, if I do a 45%, 47% haircut on deposits, the banks are going to be properly capitalized, the consumers will see through it, and they will take back their money in Bank of Cyprus. And we forgot psychology and the fear, and the people don't act rational, and we ignored it all together. And we say banking is all about confidence, and we destroyed the confidence because of this mechanistic approach. I will also say something that concerns me about the youth and the potential of the youth to bring growth, is that we will see a trend now in Cyprus emerging that the competent youths are moving out of Cyprus and into Europe because they can get employment there. There's a fear that the future potential fuel of the economy is going outside Cyprus to fuel other countries.
That is why
Irish, just if I might say, Irish people have been leaving Ireland as emigrants since the 1840s. And indeed, if they hadn't, we would never have got all the foreign investment we got from the United States, because it created a sentimental attachment to the country, which ultimately led to investment. And also, a lot of people who emigrate do return. But when they return, they're much more competent economic actors than if they'd never gone abroad in the first place. So it's not necessarily a complete loss. And at least they're staying, hopefully, within Europe. And to the extent that they contribute to Europe's prosperity, that's ultimately going to contribute to that of Cyprus.
Thanos, your first key message was fix the banks. And that's very important and obvious advice. But one of the developments that brought Ireland and Cyprus to the brink, in fact, to talking about the Memorandum of Understanding, is emergency liquidity assistance that is hanging over the Bank of Cyprus. It has hung over the banks in Ireland. Can you and perhaps John tell us how we go about managing this very important issue in the context, as you say, and as Mario said, of reestablishing confidence, attracting deposits back in the banks, and making the banks capable to participate again in the recovery and development of the country?
I think there are things that the periphery countries in crisis need to do, but there is a lot that the Eurozone has to do, and you need both. Implementing the program on the bank recapitalization and restructuring process here in Cyprus and in other countries is important. But by itself, I believe without a form of a banking union in the Eurozone might not be enough. And I think I'm personally very concerned about the bailing framework that they're thinking in the Eurozone. Although it is the right framework when you deal with one failed bank, and it creates the incentives for depositors to be careful where they deposit their money. It gives the incentive to the banks to be very careful when they invest their money. But when you implement such a framework for a banking crisis in a country, you give the incentives to people not to choose the safe bank within the country, but to choose the safe country. So I believe that unless we see a form of a banking union that the public will treat a safe bank in Cyprus the same way as a safe bank in Germany, we're not going to have a sustained recovery in the sector and in the periphery as a whole. There are steps that have been taken in this direction, but I don't think we're there yet. The framework that they are considering, I don't think will make the deposits being equal across the Eurozone. It doesn't include centralized guarantee of deposit. It doesn't include a cross-border bank resolution mechanism. Even supervision will focus on the large banks. It leaves a substantial part of the banking sector outside. So I hope that if the countries themselves deliver on the envisioned reforms to fix their banks, then it may become clear that more is needed on the banking union in the rest of the Eurozone to complete the process.
John, Thanos has given us what I consider a medium-term vision of how things might look like. But we have a more immediate problem in terms of reestablishing confidence in the banking system, and that is connected with some of the burden that the bank is now having to deal with. Is there anything that we should be thinking about, more creative, that relates also to the Irish experience?
I'm not sure that there is. Ireland, unlike Spain, hasn't gone very far in dealing with the non-performing loan situation, because we've had, first of all, a legal obstacle to repossession of houses in what is known as the Dunn judgment. And the banks are only beginning now to actually engage with individual borrowers to deal with their situations. So I don't think that there's anything particularly useful that we would have to contribute to in that respect. Obviously, if you can put in a lot of money into the banks in the form of capital, which we did, that's a help to the banks. I would, however, just have a quick comment on Thanas's answer, to agree very strongly with him about what he said about the idea that depositors are going to be able to take responsibility for ensuring that the money that they put their deposit in is safe. This is more of this sort of efficient market theory nonsense, which you see in the debate on healthcare in the United States, where it's assumed that every individual knows exactly what form of health insurance they should buy, because they know when they're going to get sick. Will it be 10 years' time or 15 years' time, and what form of sickness it's going to be, and therefore what sort of cover they should buy. It isn't possible for people, individuals, to know that sort of stuff. And therefore, it equally isn't possible for an ordinary depositor to know which of the Irish banks is the safest one to put your money into. They can look at this year's accounts, but they don't know where the bad loans are hidden. And indeed, very often the managing director of the bank himself doesn't know where the bad loans are. So how is a depositor supposed to know? And yet this sort of stuff emanates from people who are, schooled in market economics, as if it contains the answers to everything. Now, I'm for the free market. I'm not a man of the left, but I think we've got to have certain modesty about the insights of economics in this area. And I think if there was a bit of behavioral economics brought to bear on it, that proposal would be seen to be not so good. Now, on ELA, I think the problem here is legal. Can the ECB engage in something that isn't just monetary policy, but is essentially a sort of form of bailing out of banks by surreptitiously extending durations of assistance and so forth? And we have, a number of eagle-eyed economists in Germany in particular, who got 4.6% of the vote, I think, in the recent German election for their party, who are watching all the time anything that the ECB does to see is it, trespassing over its strict monetary policy mandate. And I think that's the difficulty. I think you've got to understand, just as the Germans need to understand Cypriot politics if they're to make wise decisions, we, Irish and Cypriots, we need to understand German politics too, to see the limitations under which they're operating.
Yes, Marios.
I think also the way the ECB acted, and you know it better, during the negotiations, using the ELA as a blackmailing tool, it has demonized the ELA, which is supposed to be a stabilizing factor for banks. It has created the impression to the people that the ELA is there and to be pulled out and for the bank to collapse at a whim's moment.
And it was used to precipitate the Irish bailout as well. But.
And therefore, I think people justifiably are scared of it, while the purpose of it is exactly the opposite.
Yes.
To stabilize the bank.
Yes. But Marios, until November 2012, the ECB said, look, I am not going to get into politics. I am giving you emergency liquidity assistance on the assumption that you will go to a program and that banks will be able to recapitalize like we have agreed in October 26, when the heads of state agreed that anybody, John, we would refer to the PSI, there is an explicit agreement telling every country affected by the PSI, you go to your shareholders, new and existing, you go to your government. If you cannot find the money, come to us and we'll recapitalize your banks, provided you do a program. Here in Cyprus, we missed that opportunity throughout 2012 until it was too late. And the Germans, in those horrible nights in March, were telling us this 4.9 that the European skeptics got would easily become 10%, meaning that if Germany was seen to go through a traditional bailout program of another country, it would be disastrous for the domestic politics, which really underscores how much we gambled by allowing ourselves to get so close to the German election before deciding we wanted to go into a program. Now the ECB is a lot, in some sense, more political. It threatens. It says, unless you go to a program, I will pull the plug and you have to leave the Eurozone, basically, if you can't find the money to pay back the emergency liquidity assistance. And that really what precipitated both the program in Ireland and in Cyprus. At this point, I think it would be good to see, do we have any broad messages that are coming from the diaspora? I will call that the people who are listening to us on the internet. No, we have a microphone. Of course we have a microphone. Yes. Brief πράγματα. Elena.
Hi. So we have grouped the questions in basically in commons of two areas. The technical commons that basically ask, I was really excited because John Bruton brought it up. It asks, what is really the role of the international financial architecture? Is it relevant? It was built in 1945. World Bank and IMF, are they really developing organizations? And how do they handle the crisis as it is today? A second type of, I'm grouping the question again, is related to the trust level that has been very much hit, not only in Cyprus, but as a symbol to the rest of the European Union. And the question is, how do you really restructure or reestablish trust in an environment that money, which is a trusting game, as John Bruton mentioned, it's pretty much on hold right now because in Cyprus, banks are operating because you're under specific measures.
Okay.
And the third group of questions, actually two more, is all related to what is the new business plan of Cyprus? A lot of diaspora Cypriots are asking, I'm coming back to Cyprus for a job, and where will I find a job? Will I be an accountant or a banker? Or, you know, it doesn't seem to be anymore the place I can find a job. So what would be the new business plan of Cyprus? And really, people don't seem to understand what structural reforms are. I think we have been confusing fiscal austerity measures with structural reform.
Okay, thank you, Elena.
Two more points only, because I had somebody who requested. It's related to Athanasios Vamvakidis' previous remarks. Athanasios had mentioned in the past that you need to get away of the 500 euro bill. So there is this proposal from George Economidis that keeps on asking, why don't we get rid of all money in terms of paper and we just have coins? I need to mention that because we're opening this to 5,000 people that are listening to us.
Okay.
And what would be from Maria Yorgalos from Argentina, what are the ethical pillars, the ethical new pillars of the European Union, And how are the German elections affecting these ethical pillars of the European Union? Both of them are related to, the first one is to Mr. Iliadis, the second one is to Mr. Bruton.
Okay, obviously we have a very thoughtful and philosophical diaspora. But let's see, I think we have tackled to some extent the question of the new economic model, but this business of rebuilding and re-establishing trust, you know, the assumption that you do a bail-in and over 48 hours you get 6 billion that will take Greece and Ireland 10 years of, as Thanasis said, or more, of primary surpluses, and ignoring the fact that on Tuesday morning you open the banks and you have to have capital controls, and you have to ask the question, will I still have functioning banks? How long does it take, and what will it take specifically, as specifically as we can, to rebuild this trust?
Well, it goes back to implementation, and if we think of the emerging market crisis in the last couple of decades, we have the example of the East Asia financial crisis that Korea implemented the program. Many people forget Korea had the crisis actually back in 97, 98, and now is one of the best performing emerging markets. And actually, it took about, in the third year of the program, it had a very fast recovery. If we look at Latin America, for example, Argentina has never really recovered, never joined the international capital markets, because they follow a completely different path. So you need to address the causes that led to the crisis and implement the reforms that you need in order to restructure your economy. There is no easy way, but it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as you move in the right direction. And on this, I think it is important to emphasize that at least the first review in Cyprus has been concluded successfully. So a good beginning, it's something important. It's the first step.
Marios?
I'll go along with what John was saying. We need to engage behavioral economists in this exercise, because they marry psychology and human behavior into the solutions. And some of the solutions might be as simple as not playing Bank of Cyprus every night in the news. The people tend to forget, but if you hammer it every night, you create the problem, you amplify it. It's these kind of things that we need, and it's outside the domain of the main economists, but we need to get advice either from behavioral economists that are developing this kind of expertise of psychologists or communications experts on how to calm down the fears of the people.
John, do you want to add?
Well, I look at my own country and I see in the media all the time, even though everyone knows we are a country that can't, until now, borrow money commercially because we were in such a bad financial situation. And yet, all the time in the media, every news story is about where the government isn't spending enough money on this, that, or the other, or some issue where the government should step in to solve the problem by spending money. And I think we do need to have more discussions like this one, where the actual choices that people in politics are facing are laid before people, so you don't have unreasonable expectations being raised, and people join up the dots, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that when the Greek crisis first started, the IMF was demonized in the sense that the Europeans first reacted as if this is a family affair, we want to keep the IMF out. By the time we came to Cyprus, the Germans were basically saying we have absolutely no faith in what the Commission says. We will go by what the IMF says on debt sustainability, on the need for fiscal adjustment, on the need for structural reform. And it's very interesting now, that in the case of Cyprus, the most recent missions that have come to help us come really from the World Bank, as John said, that are concerned more about repositioning the country to develop in a different way. The reform of the public sector, the reform of the welfare state, liberalizing the economy, the kinds of things that we have neglected over time. And that really emphasizes the point that implementing this memorandum of understanding may be pleasing to those who are lending us, but it will be even more pleasing to the next generations in the sense that we will finally implement things that we have been saying and talking about for a long time, but never came around despite this consensus. It was consensus against celebrating false victories, like a very fast growth rate based on the construction sector. But as John said, if you project that, then the whole GDP will become the construction sector. It was growing, and it was clearly unsustainable, and it had to come to an end. And we hear talk in Cyprus here also now that we need to revive the construction sector. We need to protect it. So we need to think very, very carefully how is it that we go forward. But now I think we should open the discussion to some questions from the floor, from those people who have stayed around. And I see a hand there, so I think Mr. Kiamidis will be the first one. Yes.
Thank you. Two specific questions. The first one is, there are 28 countries in the European Union and 17 in the Eurozone. What is really the legal framework? Is it compulsory for all countries in the European Union to join the Eurozone, and vice versa? If a country doesn't make it in the Eurozone, can it come back to the European Union? And the second question, and it's very topical, and it's very fortunate that the meeting is tonight, because tomorrow is a big day for Cyprus. Tomorrow is the completion of the 6 months that we have capital controls in the Eurozone. According to Article 66 of the European Union Treaty, you can only have capital controls up to a maximum of 6 months. What happens now, Mr. Bruton? Presumably we get an extension, or are we witnessing the beginning of the second-tier euro? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I can answer the factual part, if I may. Unless you are England, who has opted out, or Sweden and Denmark that have a derogation, if you join the European Union, you have to begin working towards complying to the conditions of joining the Eurozone. Getting out of the Eurozone is unimaginable. Joining the Eurozone is relatively easy in the sense that you have contracts that are translated from your national currency into the euro at some rate. Going back to your national currency has so many winners and losers that it will be impossible to just envisage that possibility. On capital controls, this is a very good point. And in fact it was surprising how easily the ECB on that terrible night again was cavalier about saying, yes, we will impose a haircut and we will go to capital controls. When we all know that is basically going to a different euro when you go into capital controls. So the question, and John, you are the keynote speaker, so you get the tough questions. What do we do for the second 6 months of capital controls? Because there was a prediction, John, that January is the day that they will come off, yes? Or at least somebody said so. John?
Well, I think strictly speaking, it is possible to break the law and get away with it if everybody agrees that that's what you should do. There is a good example of that in your question. It's true that Britain and Denmark have an opt-out from joining the euro. Sweden doesn't actually have an opt-out from joining the euro, but they're getting away with not joining the euro, which is, strictly speaking, breaking the law. And I suppose the same sort of blind eye will be turned to this derogation from tomorrow if capital controls continue. Some people have written, that I read, that once you introduce capital controls, it's impossible to get rid of them. I hope and I think that you're beginning to prove that that's wrong, that in fact you are moving progressively towards getting rid of capital controls, having introduced them. And if you do, I think that will be something that will be proving some economists wrong and hopefully resolving the problem. There was another question asked earlier about the ethical basis of the European Union. I'd just like to come in on that. The ethical basis of the European Union can be summed up in 3 words: no more war. It exists in order to create such a pooling of our resources that the nations of Europe will be like 2 boxers in a clinch. They're so close together that they can't swing a punch at one another. And that's what we're trying to create, using economics to create a level of mutual dependence that prevents war from recurring again. And as such, it is a very noble thing, and it's more than a matter of money.
Just a footnote, John. The countries that really should have been keener to join the euro because they have labor market flexibility and competitiveness are the ones who opted out. And the ones that lined up to join are the ones who were ready to take the low interest rates that John referred to and forget about the obligations of being in the Eurozone. That really is one of the true paradoxes. Yes, a question right here, please. A microphone is coming to you, sir, if you can wait for a second. Thank you.
In fact, I wonder whether economic theory is in a bit of a runaway situation at the moment. Because one goes into the library here in the University of Nicosia and the University of Cyprus, and we have the general economic literature, the American Economic Review, the general microeconomic policy or macroeconomic policy, and many other journals. And what we have in front of us is a situation where government is trying to raise money through taxation to raise government spending. Now, we have also a central bank which might print or might not print money, which would create an inflation spiral. Now, and further than that, we have, I've gone through the economic prizes in economics, the Nobel prizes in economics, Nobel.org, all prizes in economic sciences. And we have there games theory, theory of conflict. But let me be more specific. We have rational expectations. And Mr. Pissarides is unemployment in equilibrium theory.
Yes.
Unemployment is a key issue. I discussed with you, Dr. Sharrys, with the CPI, if you remember, the manufacturing base and production of commodities through commodities. Now, it's a bit lengthy question, but I'm sorry about this. In fact, we have a horizon for planning, horizon for investment, horizon for growth, and a distinction between growth and investment. And you also have to think about sustainable development.
Yeah. Okay, I think that was a useful comment. I think, does anybody want to respond to that, Marios?
I mean, you know the joke where they say the economics is the only science that can give Nobel to 2 different people that say opposing views. It's true, but and this is part of the problem that we accept efficient markets till somebody comes and destroys it. But this is also the evolution of science. Somebody says something, we believe it, and then somebody comes and destroys it, and we learn.
I think it's fair to say that economics is an art and not a science.
Yes.
Okay, we will take one more question from Mr. Apostolides and one in the back, so we don't discriminate against the back painters. But wait your turn, okay? Yes, Kostas. A brief question, if you would, please.
Yes, definitely. Mr. Bruton, I enjoyed your presentation. However, you did not mention the advantages in attracting foreign investment arising from the tax position in Ireland. Now, Ireland, Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Malta have somewhat similar corporation tax positions. The Germans, in considering the Cyprus case, said they would destroy the current model. An essential part of that model is the low corporation tax. What would be the position of Ireland? And is there cooperation between the four states on how we deal with what I consider will be a German onslaught on this? Thank you.
Okay. Can we perhaps, can you give the microphone in the back there so we have the next question, and then we will close by way of closing remarks and trying to respond to those two queries.
The question is primarily to you, former Prime Minister, Mr. Sarrís. Mr. Bruton said about the low taxes, and he's absolutely right. I did my thesis on the European sovereign debt crisis. Anyway, when you were a minister, is there a way you could raise the interest rates? Could you raise the interest rates while we were going on the euro? Could you take a little hike up the interest rates, or you couldn't? That's my burning questions, because we have at least avoided the land boom bubble. Could you do something, or you couldn't?
Okay. Perhaps we can start from that. In fact, interest rates in Cyprus, driven largely by the absence of the interbank market and by the fact that they depended on the deposit rates and the competition between the cooperative movement and the Greek banks. You remember all those stories about who was responsible for this zero-sum game where people would raise interest rates on deposits, and then we had a very high-cost banking system, labor agreements that meant that the banks had very high costs, that they were easily, in a non-competitive environment, able to pass them on to unsuspecting borrowers. So in Cyprus, we had a relatively higher interest rates than the rest of Europe. What our mistake was although we had no monetary policy flexibility, we had prudential policy flexibility. We could, for example, have continued a policy of requiring from non-Cypriots who had euro deposits to have a high reserve requirement, the same that we had with the pound. That would have kept the growth of credit from being the crazy 30% when the economy was growing only in monetary terms, only at 6-7%, meaning real growth plus inflation. So our problem really was one of not curtailing the growth of credit, not the price of credit. We had so much inflow of Russian money that banks didn't know what to do with it, except to lend it out to people who were willing to pay high interest rates, because whatever they were buying with it was appreciating in value in bubble. So I hope that begins to answer a little bit your question. Then the first question has to do with this favorable tax system, and how does it compare between the countries that are really featuring it, and are the Germans really envious of that? I think there was a set of interconnected questions there.
The Irish corporation tax system is a simple enough tax system. The tax rate is 12.5%. There are no special deals for individual companies. as far as what's allowable as an expense for tax purposes is concerned, and so on. And to change tax policy in the European Union requires unanimity. It's one of the areas where unanimity is retained, and Ireland has a veto, and Ireland will veto any proposal to change the 12.5% rate. In the case of Cyprus, I understand as part of the agreement, you were asked to bring your rate up to 12.5%, but you're not asked to bring it up any higher than 12.5%. So it would appear that the EU is actually accepting 12.5% as a sort of a floor. And I'm quite proud of that, because I was the one that introduced the 12.5% in Ireland, even the half, which is an important part of it. Just one last point I want to make in general, and thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking here. I think it is very important that we find language to communicate with people to show that what we're looking for is actually common sense, that living within your means, having a money flow that enables businesses to expand, creating credibility and trust are all, this is not arcane science, it's simple common sense, and we've got to try and find a way of conveying that to people. And that's why I think one of the questions that came in from the diaspora is important, where somebody asked, what is structural reform? And we've been talking about structural reform all night. Well, from my mind, structural reform is removing barriers that prevent people from allocating talent, time, and money that's currently engaged in something that gets a relatively low rate of return in profit to something that gets a higher rate of return in profit. It's simply a matter of letting the blood flow through the body. It's structural reform is removing blockages in the arteries of the economy. That's what it is. And it has all sorts of individual manifestations, the activities of notaries, the fees you have to pay for this, that, or the other. These are all things that need to be, quotes, structurally reformed because they potentially block the arteries of the economy. But I think if we can use analogies like that to explain structural reform to people, they might accept it more readily.
Thank you, John. That's very, very articulate remark. We will go to you now, Thanos, for a brief, if I may, closing remark, and then to Marios.
I think I will end on a positive note. I'm cautiously optimistic. And first, as I say, the Cyprus program had a good start, but also, as Mr. Sarrής emphasized, the causes of the crisis in Cyprus can be seen in mistakes and missed opportunities in recent years. It's not like in Greece that it took 30 years of mistakes, and when you look at all the evolution of the different macroeconomic numbers and the debt, you say, what took so long? It is relatively recently that the imbalances were built in Cyprus, and the starting position is not as bad as in other countries. It is difficult, it's not easy, but it's all a matter of doing the necessary reforms, and I think fixing the problem, it's easier than in some of the other countries. So from this point of view, I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think in a year from now, when we have a few more reviews of the program successfully completed, the Cyprus economy will start looking towards a recovery.
Thank you, Thanos. Marios?
I will echo what John said about structural reforms, that it's inducing people to go to the right place to work. It's inconceivable that the dreams of every Cypriot was to get a job as a civil servant instead of producing something, to queue to become a teacher because we had distorted wages, the wages in the civil service, or to become a banker because we had a union holding the wages up. This is what we need to do. And as John said before, the emphasis usually tends to be on the numbers. The balance, the government deficit, we meet the target and so on, and we forget this. And these are the longer term issues.
Okay. This is where we come to an end. I think the lady will thank the speakers, but I'd like to also say something. I'd like to acknowledge Marios Iliadis' tireless work over the last few months to put this event together. Marios had heard John speak at some conference, and he said to a small group of friends, we really have to bring John to Cyprus, and I think tonight we see why. I also like to thank Elena Panariti and her group, Thought for Action, that has really revolutionized in some sense the way we do business by having people listening and asking questions. I also like to thank, I hope they are still listening to us, the English service of the Cyprus Broadcasting Corporation, in which this is being broadcast live. And I'd like to thank you all for coming here tonight, and I hope you are going away a little wiser.
At this point, we would like to express our sincere appreciation to Mr. John Bruton for his presence here tonight. In addition, we thank Mr. Sarrής, Mr. Vamvakidis, and Mr. Kliridis for their most valuable contribution to the event and the roundtable discussion. Special thanks to Mr. Márιος Ηλιάδης for his contribution, passion, and hard work for more than 6 months now for making tonight's event happening. We would also like to express our gratitude to our sponsors, PwC, Hellenic Pang, and Hyperion Systems Engineering for their contribution and support. We also thank our communication sponsors, CYMBC and Φιλελεύθερος newspaper. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending to tonight's event. You are all invited to the foyer for the reception. Have a good night.